I am Arabella Harrington, 34 years old. My entire family has dismissed me as nothing more than a filing clerk for the past 11 years. Nobody anticipated that a simple family gathering in the Surrey suburbs would end with the unmistakable sound of bone breaking. When James, my supposedly heroic cousin fresh from Royal Marines basic training, lunged at me with a manic grin, convinced he would drive me into the grass like a rag doll, he hadn't accounted for one crucial detail. My reflexes weren't honed at summer camps or private schools. They were forged in the scorching deserts and frozen mountains of active conflict zones. The moment his hands touched me, the thick scent of stale lager vanished, replaced instantly by the metallic tang of blood. 6 seconds. That was all the time I required to transform the family's golden child into an unconscious heap at my feet and expose my mother's carefully constructed hypocrisy. If you've ever been underestimated by your own blood, if you've ever felt invisible among those who share your name, comment, and subscribe, this story is for the forgotten ones. 2 hours before the ambulance sirens split the humid Surrey air, I was sitting in my saloon at the end of my mother's driveway. On the car speakers, a former SAS operator was discussing the tactical advantage of being underestimated, the discipline of strategic silence. It was the only world that truly made sense to me anymore. I looked at the house, a Victorian semi-detached with manicured gardens and a driveway wide enough for 4 vehicles. The sort of place that whispered old money and respectable suburban dreams. Already the curb was lined with Range Rovers and expensive SUVs, their number plates gleaming, their bumpers decorated with Union Jack stickers that most of their owners didn't fully understand. I reached for the volume dial and silenced the engine. Quiet flooded the cabin. I took a breath, held it for 4 counts, then released it slowly. This was the ritual. I needed to shed the operator, the trained specialist who analyzed threat vectors and breach points with mathematical precision, and become Arabella, the mousy, forgettable administrative assistant who supposedly processed filing for a defense logistics company in London. It was the heaviest armor I'd ever had to wear. I stepped from the car and adjusted my spectacles. Non-prescription lenses, another prop designed to soften my appearance, to make me seem harmless and unremarkable. The air carried the scent of charcoal, lighter fluid, and grilling sausages. Beneath that familiar aroma, I detected something else. Tension. Walking into the rear garden felt like stepping onto a stage where everyone had rehearsed their lines except me. The noise was staggering. Chart music blared from the patio speakers, competing with the raucous laughter of men holding cold tins of lager. In the center of it all, presiding over the grill like a conquering general, stood James Ashford. He was 24, with hair cut so short his scalp gleamed beneath the afternoon sun. His tight Royal Marines physical tracing shirt clung to his chest, deliberately showcasing the muscle he'd built during his initial training phase. He held a lager in one hand and tongs in the other, gesturing expansively as he recounted his time at Pirbright Military Training Center. "Listen," James shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "The sergeant instructors tried to break us. They genuinely tried. But it's all about mental toughness, yeah? It's a mindset. Civilians don't understand. Nobody outside the service really gets it." Aunt Patricia and Aunt Margaret gazed at him with eyes full of uncritical adoration, nodding as if he were explaining quantum physics. "Oh, he's so brave," Patricia said, touching his arm. "Our little warrior." I stood by the sliding glass doors, entirely invisible. A warrior? He'd barely finished basic training. He hadn't deployed anywhere. He hadn't heard a single shot fired in anger. He hadn't felt the concussive force of an IED rattling his teeth and cracking his ribs. He was raw, untested, with an ego substantially larger than his rucksack. But here in this garden, amongst these people, he was Captain Britain himself. A sudden dryness seized my throat. I slipped into the kitchen, searching for water or something stronger. The interior was cooler, but the air felt heavier somehow, suffocating with childhood memories I'd spent years trying to compartmentalize. I walked to the counter where the drinks sat waiting. I reached for a glass of white wine, needing something to dull the sharp edges threatening to surface. Put it down. The voice came from behind me, sharp as a whip crack. I didn't flinch. I never flinched anymore, but I froze. I turned to find my mother, Catherine. She was wiping her hands on a floral dish towel, her eyes scanning me with that familiar expression of disappointment and barely concealed disgust. She stepped forward and physically snatched the glass from my hand. Wine sloshed over the rim, staining her fingers, but she didn't seem to care. "Don't drink that," she hissed, her voice deliberately low so the guests couldn't hear. "A woman drinking alone in the kitchen looks cheap, Arabella. It looks desperate." "I'm 34, Mum," I said quietly, my voice practiced and controlled. "I simply wanted a glass of wine." "You want attention," she corrected, placing the glass completely out of my reach on the far side of the counter. She gestured toward the window where James was now laughing, throwing his head back with theatrical abandon. "Look at James. Look at his posture. That is what success looks like. That is what a capable man resembles. He's serving his country. He's protecting us all. And what are you doing? Filing documents, hiding yourself in oversized jumpers, unable to find a suitable partner at 34. The insult was precise, calculated to wound. She despised my job because she couldn't boast about it at her book club. She hated my clothes because they didn't conform to her ideas of femininity. She had absolutely no idea that these supposedly oversized jumpers concealed a jagged line of scar tissue running along my lower ribs. A souvenir from an extraction operation gone wrong in Aleppo 5 months previously. "I'm genuinely pleased for James," I lied, keeping my voice level. "You should be," she snapped, returning her attention to her potato salad with theatrical dismissal. "Now go outside and try to look pleasant. And for heaven's sake, don't embarrass me today." I walked out the back door, humiliation burning in my chest. Not because her words held truth, but because I had to allow them to land without reaction. I had to absorb the blow. I couldn't tell her that while James was learning formation marching, I was leading a team through night raids. I couldn't tell her that the documents I file are actually intelligence reports on terror networks. I couldn't tell her any of it because the mission required silence. I needed air, real air. I skirted the edge of the patio, deliberately avoiding eye contact with my cousins, and made my way to the far corner of the garden near the old oak tree. Someone was already there. Grandfather Ted sat in his folding garden chair, maintaining deliberate distance from the chaos. He was 77, a Falkland Islands veteran who rarely spoke. The family assumed he was becoming senile because he stared into space frequently. I understood better. He wasn't staring at nothing. He was watching everything. He didn't acknowledge my approach, but he shifted his legs to make room for me in the adjacent space. He was nursing a small tumbler of amber liquid. No ice. "He's loud." Grandfather Ted grunted, not gesturing toward James, but we both understood who he meant. "He's excited," I offered, leaning against the rough bark. "He's a pup barking at leaves," Ted muttered, taking a slow, deliberate sip. Then he turned his head with deliberate slowness and looked directly at me. His eyes were clouded with age, but the gaze itself was piercing. He studied my hands, which rested calmly at my sides. No tremors. Knuckles scarred but relaxed. "You good, kid?" "I'm fine, grandfather." "Shoulders are tight," he observed, and there was weight in his voice. "Carrying something heavy." He wasn't referring to luggage. A chill traveled down my spine. Out of everyone in this family, this old man was the only one who might possibly suspect. "Just work stress," I said softly. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. He looked back toward the grill, where James was now puffing out his chest, pointing to the gleaming Royal Marines eagle and globe insignia he'd pinned to his civilian shirt. A breach of protocol, though nobody present cared. The sun caught the metal, making it flash like a beacon of unearned virtue. Involuntarily, my hand drifted to my side, pressing against fabric. Underneath, the scar felt rigid and inflamed. A piece of shrapnel the size of a coin had missed my kidney by barely an inch. I hadn't received a medal for it. I hadn't received a party. I'd been patched up by a field medic in darkness, and returned to rotation within 3 weeks. The family cheered as James flipped a burger into the air and caught it with theatrical flair. "Let him have his moment," Grandfather Ted whispered, almost to himself. "The quiet ones. We know the bill always comes due. I nodded, swallowing bitter understanding. I thought I could simply remain in the shadows, survive the afternoon, and leave before dark. I didn't know that within the next hour the charade would collapse entirely, and the violence I kept locked away would become the only thing standing between me and the ground. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long golden shadows across the manicured grass, but the heat remained oppressive and sticky. James had claimed center stage again. He was sitting on the edge of a garden lounger, surrounded by my aunts and several neighbors, dramatically unlacing one of his pristine military-issue boots. He grimaced, sucking air through his teeth as if extracting shrapnel from his own flesh. "Mate," he groaned, finally peeling away a thick wool sock. "You lot have no idea." 12 miles in full kit, my feet were absolutely bleeding. "Blisters the size of coins," Aunt Patricia gasped, covering her mouth with a hand adorned with too many rings. "Oh, you poor thing. Look at that blister." "Margaret, fetch the first aid kit from inside. He needs antiseptic cream." I looked. It was a blister, a small pink bubble of fluid, perhaps the size of a penny. It wasn't bleeding. It wasn't infected. It was the sort of friction burn you'd get from wearing new shoes on the high street. But to them, it was a badge of honor. It was evidence of his sacrifice. "It's honestly fine, Patricia," James said, waving her off with false modesty, clearly relishing the attention. "Marines don't complain. Pain is simply weakness leaving the body, yeah?" The phrase, a cliché printed on every recruitment poster in every force's office in Britain, made my stomach turn. Pain is weakness leaving the body. Unconsciously, I shifted my weight, and a sharp electric jolt shot up my right side, catching my breath for a fraction of a second. I forced my face to remain neutral, forced my lungs to expand against the restriction of the compression bandage concealed beneath my oversized jumper. The memory didn't ask permission, it simply kicked the door open. 5 months ago, in the mountains of Helmand Province, not a sunny garden in England. Pitch darkness, the kind of darkness that swallows you whole. My team was moving fast, extracting a high-value target before the local militia realized our presence. I'd taken point. I didn't see the drop, a 10-foot fall into a ravine filled with jagged stone. I landed hard. The sound was distinct, a dry snap like a branch breaking beneath a boot, 2 ribs fractured on impact. The pain was blinding, a white-hot poker shoved into my side. But we were in hostile territory. Silence was our only protection. I didn't scream. I didn't groan. I bit my lip until I tasted blood. I pushed myself upright and signaled I'm good to my team leader. We had 5 miles to reach the extraction point. Every step was agony. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. But I walked. I carried my equipment. I carried the weight because the mission demanded it. There was no Aunt Patricia to fetch cream. There was only the mission and the people beside me. Arabella. Aunt Margaret's voice snapped me back to reality. The mountains dissolved, replaced by charcoal and cut grass. She was looking at me, holding a plate of deviled eggs, her face arranged in what she imagined was a friendly smile. "You're so lucky you don't have to manage things like that," she said, gesturing vaguely at James's foot. "James is so brave, risking his body. Your job, what is it exactly? At least you get air conditioning all day, yeah? No blisters for you, right?" "Right," I said. The word tasted like ash. Just administration. Data processing. "Must be nice," James chimed in, smirking as he rubbed his heel. "Civilian life. Safe, comfortable. Nobody screaming in your face." My mother, who'd been listening from the doorway, let out a short, derisive laugh. Easy is what Arabella does best. She's always chosen the simplest path available. That was the second strike. The first had been the wine glass. This one was aimed directly at my soul. And just like that, an older memory resurfaced, deeper and more painful than broken ribs. 11 years ago, the day I left for selection. The day I packed everything into a duffel bag, terrified and exhilarated, ready to serve something bigger than myself. My father had already passed. I stood in the hallway waiting for my mother to say goodbye, to tell me she was proud, to tell me be safe. She hadn't even looked up from her magazine. "You're going?" she asked, turning a page. "Yes, Mum. The recruiter is outside." She finally looked at me, her eyes cold and utterly hard. You're not doing this for patriotism, Arabella. Don't deceive yourself. You're running away. You're doing this because no man will stay with you. You're joining the service to hide from the fact that you're a failure as a woman. You're broken. Broken. The word echoed in my skull now, 11 years later, as I stood surrounded by people who shared my surname but didn't know my name. They saw a spinster. They saw a disappointment. They saw someone who'd chosen an office job because she couldn't handle real life. My hand trembled slightly. I clenched it into a fist, hiding it in my cardigan pocket. The anger was rising, hot and dangerous. I wanted to tear off this jumper. I wanted to lift my shirt and show them the purple and yellow bruising wrapped around my torso like armor made of violence. I wanted to show them the scar on my shoulder from a bullet graze in Yemen. I wanted to scream, I have bled more for this country in a week than James will in his entire lifetime. But I didn't because that wasn't the job. The job was silence. The job was letting them sleep soundly, blissfully ignorant of the monsters I fought in darkness. If they knew what I did, if they knew what I was capable of, they wouldn't look at me with pity. They would look at me with fear. And I didn't want my mother to fear me. I wanted her to love me. I took a deep breath, fighting the sharp stabbing pain in my ribs. I needed an anchor, something to hold before I lost control. I closed my eyes briefly and whispered the words that had sustained me through frozen nights and burning firefights. Words of King David, a warrior poet who understood being underestimated by his own family. Blessed be the Lord, my strength which teacheth my hands to war and my fingers to fight. Psalm 144:1. It wasn't a prayer for peace, it was a prayer for capability. It was a reminder that my scars weren't signs of failure. They were proof of my training. God had forged me in fire, even if my family only saw the ashes. Are you okay, Arabella? James asked, his voice dripping with mock concern. You look absolutely pale. Maybe the heat is getting to you, yeah? Admin workers aren't built for this sort of thing. I opened my eyes. The world came back into focus. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the insecurity behind the bravado. I saw a boy playing soldier because he needed validation. I'm fine, James, I said, my voice perfectly steady. Just slightly warm. You should consider getting ice on that blister. Infection can set in rapidly. He laughed, dismissing me entirely. Yeah, cheers for that, Bella. Professional medical advice from the filing clerk. I turned away, walking back toward the corner where Grandfather Ted was still watching. I gently pressed my hand against my injured side, feeling the broken bones shift minutely beneath my touch. A secret pain, a silent honor. If you've ever had to smile whilst carrying a burden nobody else can see, like this comment and tell me in the comments what sacrifice your family has never understood. I am strong. They don't need to know, I whispered to the wind, repeating the mantra that kept me functional. As long as they're safe, that's enough. But as I watched James, who was now consuming his fourth lager and becoming increasingly loud, a darker thought crept forward. They were safe from the world, yes. But were they safe from themselves? Were they safe from the hubris spreading like a disease through this garden party? I had a feeling that safety was about to shatter completely, and, unlike my ribs, this fracture wouldn't heal quietly. The sun was descending now, painting the Surrey sky in bruised purples and oranges, but the party showed absolutely no signs of slowing. If anything, the alcohol had intensified everything. The air was thick with cheap cologne mixed with charcoal smoke, a combination that was starting to trigger a headache behind my eyes. I was leaning against the deck railing, swirling melting ice in my cup of water, trying to disappear into the background. It was a skill I'd perfected over years of undercover operations. Becoming gray, becoming forgettable. But forgettable wasn't on James's agenda. He spotted me from across the patio. I saw his eyes lock onto mine, glossy and unfocused from perhaps his fifth lager. He grinned like a predator who'd spotted prey and started weaving through the crowd toward me. Hey, there she is, James bellowed, slinging a heavy arm across my shoulders. Our family's very own paperwork warrior. The girl who keeps the filing systems running. He squeezed my shoulder hard, his fingers digging into muscle. I didn't flinch. I simply stood there and let him play his game. So, Arabella, he slurred, leaning in close, his breath hot and sour. I was just telling Uncle Richard about the difference between real operators and the rest. You know what rear echelon means, don't you? I understood perfectly. Anyone not deployed to active operations, support staff, administrators. In his framework, that's all I was. Someone without real experience. I've heard the term, I said evenly, taking a sip of my water. Yeah, well, you're the definition, mate. You're a classic rear echelon type. James laughed, scanning the crowd for validation. Aunt Margaret and Uncle Richard were already chuckling, eager to be included. See, while blokes like me are actually out there, actively deployed, you lot are just back at base, enjoying the comforts. My eye twitched just once. He'd mangled the terminology to impress civilians who didn't know a rifle from a rake. Sounds intense, I said, my voice completely flat. Intense? You have absolutely no idea, he scoffed, puffing out his chest with theatrical bravado. You have to maintain complete situational awareness. Constant vigilance. You never know where the threat emerges. Constant vigilance. I looked at him, genuinely looked at him, and in that precise moment, the cousin I'd known vanished. In his place stood a tactical problem. My brain switched effortlessly, slipping into cold analytical mode. Target male, approximately 80 kilograms, intoxicated, balance compromised. I scanned his stance. He was leaning heavily on his left leg. His right foot crossed casually over his ankle in an arrogant pose. A sharp kick to his left knee would drop him instantly. His hands were occupied, one holding a lager, the other gesturing wildly. His chin was jutting out, completely exposed. His carotid vein pulsed visibly beneath skin. An obvious target. Analysis. Amateur. In a bar in Kandahar or an alley in Beirut, he wouldn't have lasted 10 seconds. He had zero situational awareness. He'd allowed an enemy, me, to approach within striking distance without assessing my hands or posture. He was loud. He was visible. He was a walking casualty. If this was an active operation, James, I thought silently, the words echoing loud in my skull. You'd be dead 10 times before you even dropped your lager. Are you even listening, Arabella? James poked me directly in the chest with a finger. I said you wouldn't last one day in my boots. The poke was the trigger. It was minor physical aggression, harmless in a family setting. But my body didn't acknowledge we were at a garden party. My body remembered the rules of engagement. Contact front. React. For a split second, the world slowed dramatically. My hand tightened around the plastic cup of water. The plastic crunched loudly, buckling under sudden pressure. My knuckles turned white. Every fiber of muscle memory screamed at me to move. Step in, trap the arm, strike, neutralize. It would take less than 2 seconds. I could visualize it perfectly. The shock on his face as his airway collapsed. The sound of the lager can hitting the patio stones, the silence that would follow. I took a sharp breath, forcing the violence back down into the dark box where I contained it. I released the tension in my hand, though the cup was now permanently deformed. I'm listening, James, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I'm just taking it all in. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Grandfather Ted. He was still in his garden chair beneath the oak tree, but he was no longer watching the grill. He was watching me directly. His eyes, usually clouded with age, were sharp and completely clear. He wasn't looking at my face. He was looking at my hands. He saw the crushed cup. He saw the subtle shift in my stance. The way I'd quietly positioned my body, protecting my center, ready to strike. He knew. He gave me an almost imperceptible nod. A soldier's nod. Stand down. Not here. Not yet. The connection broke as James let out a loud belch, slapping his stomach. Anyway, he announced, I'm bored with trying to provoke you since you won't actually fight back. I need another cold one. The lager keeps disappearing. You want anything, admin girl? Are you good with your water? I'm fine, I said. He rolled his eyes, turning his back on me completely. Another tactical error. He sauntered toward the cooler, shouting for Uncle Richard to toss him another beer. I exhaled slowly and shakily. The adrenaline was still humming in my veins, a low electrical buzz making my fingertips tingle. I looked down at the mangled cup. Water dripped onto my shoes, cold and clarifying. I had been tested and I had held the line, but as I watched James high-five another relative, laughing at jokes I couldn't hear, I realized something genuinely terrifying. The restraint was fraying, the mask was slipping. I wasn't certain how much longer I could maintain the role of the meek, forgettable cousin. Not when he was practically begging for a lesson. I tossed the ruined cup into the waste bin. It hit the bottom with a hollow thud. Just one more hour, I told myself silently. Survive one more hour. But the sun was setting, and the shadows were deepening. And in darkness, monsters tend to emerge and play. I simply hoped James understood before it became too late that he wasn't the monster in this story. He was the prey. The shadows beneath the oak tree were deep and cool, a sanctuary from the glaring artificial lights that had just flickered on around the patio. James had wandered over, drawn not by interest but by the need for an audience for his alcohol-fueled performance. He stood swaying slightly, holding a fresh lager, looking down at Grandfather Ted. "So, Grandpa?" James slurred, his voice too loud for the quiet corner. "You were in the Falklands, right? That must have been absolutely wild. Proper action, yeah? Like a war film." He grinned, expecting a war story full of explosions and heroism, something to validate his fantasies. Grandfather Ted didn't look up immediately. He took a slow drag from a cigarette he wasn't supposed to be smoking, doctor's orders, and exhaled a thin stream of blue smoke into the humid air. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded like gravel crunching beneath boots. "It wasn't like a film, son," Ted said softly. "It was wet. It rained for 3 weeks straight in '82. Your boots rotted on your feet. You couldn't see the enemy. You just heard the wind moving. You smelled the damp earth. The salt." He paused, his eyes drifting to a place none of us could follow. I lost my best friend Miller because he lit a cigarette at the wrong moment. Just flash. Then gone. The silence that followed was absolute, weighted with the ghosts of men who never came home. I felt a tightness in my chest, that familiar ache of shared understanding. I knew that smell. I knew that sudden violent loss. James blinked, clearly disappointed. The adrenaline-fueled story he wanted hadn't materialized. "Yeah, well," James interrupted, stifling a yawn and checking his phone. "That sounds pretty depressing, honestly. Not really the vibe for a celebration, you know? I'm going to grab another cold one. Aunt Patricia mentioned those jalapeno poppers." He turned on his heel without a second glance, leaving the old man and his trauma alone in the darkness. I watched him go, feeling disgust so potent it tasted like bile. He'd treated a veteran's pain like bad entertainment. I didn't move. I stayed right where I was, leaning against the rough oak bark. "He doesn't get it," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. "He's a tourist," Ted replied, tapping ash into the grass. "He bought the merchandise, but he hasn't paid admission." He reached into his denim jacket pocket and pulled out a silver flask. It was dented in one corner, the metal worn smooth by decades of handling. He unscrewed the cap with trembling fingers. "Cup," he commanded gently. I held out my plastic cup, now empty except for drops of warm water. He poured a generous measure of amber liquid. The smell hit me instantly. Peat, smoke, and oak. Excellent single malt scotch. Probably older than James himself. "Drink," he said. "It'll put steel in your blood." Better than that cheap lager the boys consuming. I took a sip. It burned pleasantly going down, a warm fire settling in my stomach. It tasted like history, like respect. "Thanks, Grandfather." He capped the flask and put it away. Then he shifted in his chair, moving his entire body to face me directly. His eyes narrowed, scanning me with an intensity that made me want to check my perimeter. "Your shoulder," he said. It wasn't a question. "Is it properly healed?" I froze. The glass stopped halfway to my mouth. I hadn't touched my shoulder. I hadn't winced. I hadn't favored it. At least I didn't think I had. "I don't know what you mean," I stammered, the lie clumsy on my tongue. Ted scoffed, a dry, rattling sound. "Don't insult me with lies, Arabella. I saw you flinch when you lifted that crate of soft drinks. Just a small twitch in your jaw, and you're guarding your right side. You walk like you're balancing weight. Damaged goods trying to look normal." He leaned forward, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Shrapnel or a direct hit?" I stared at him, my defenses crumbling. For 11 years I'd fooled my mother, I'd fooled my aunts, I'd fooled everyone in this suburban charade. But I couldn't fool him. Experience recognizes experience. "Fall," I whispered, the truth slipping out before I could stop it. Broken ribs 5 months ago. He nodded slowly, absorbing the information. There was no pity in his expression, only recognition. The look one warrior gives another across the gulf of years. Rough terrain, rough enough. And the family thinks you're sitting at a desk typing. It's better that way, I said, looking toward the house where laughter was growing increasingly raucous. Mum needs to believe I'm safe. She needs to believe I'm ordinary. If she knew the truth, it would destroy her. Ted snorted. Your mum is fragile, Arabella. She fractures if the wind blows the wrong direction. But you, he reached out, his weathered hand covering mine where it rested on the armrest. His grip was surprisingly powerful. You're made of something entirely different. You're tougher than steel, kid. Tears pricked the back of my eyes suddenly and hot. I blinked them away frantically. I hadn't cried when I broke my ribs. I hadn't cried when the medic set them. But hearing this old man, this forgotten warrior, truly see me, truly recognize me, cracked something open inside my chest. I feel like I'm disappearing sometimes, I confessed, my voice barely audible above the crickets. Like Arabella is just a ghost, and the only real thing is the work. The work ends, the war ends. But you have to survive the peace. Arabella, that's the hardest part. Surviving the peace among people who don't understand its cost. He took a swig from his flask, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. You're not a ghost, he added quietly. You're the only real thing in this entire postcode. We sat in silence for a moment, sipping our drinks. Two soldiers from different wars finding common frequency in the static of civilian life. It was the most peaceful I'd felt in months. But peace is fragile. A loud crash from the patio shattered the moment. Glass breaking. Laughter that sounded more like braying. I looked up. James was standing on top of a cooler, swaying dangerously, holding a fresh lager high like a trophy. He was shouting something about combat techniques. Grandfather Ted's expression hardened instantly. The warmth vanished. His eyes went cold. Eyes that had seen terrible things. Watch him, Ted murmured, his voice low and dangerous. He's just drunk, I said, trying to dismiss the unease crawling my spine. No, Ted said, shaking his head with absolute certainty. He's not just drunk. He's weak, and he's scared. And a frightened boy with something to prove is the most dangerous thing on earth. He squeezed my hand with intention. A warning grip. Be ready, Arabella, he whispered. The dog that barks loudest is usually the one about to snap. And when he does, don't you dare hold back. I looked at James, truly looked at him, and saw the frantic energy in his movements, the desperate need for validation spiraling out of control. Grandfather Ted was right. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here, and I was the only one holding an umbrella made of steel. The warning from Grandfather Ted hung in the air like ozone before lightning. The dog that barks the loudest is usually the one about to snap. It didn't take long for him to snap. James was bored. The adrenaline from his war stories had faded, replaced by the sloppy aggressive buzz of excessive cheap lager. He was prowling the patio, searching for a target, something to dominate now that the old man had dismissed him. His eyes landed on Lucas. My nephew, 13 years old, was a quiet kid with messy hair and glasses slightly too large for his face. He was sitting on the edge of a planter, engrossed in a video game on his mobile phone, trying to make himself invisible as I usually did. He was the family's target, too sensitive, too artistic, not interested in football or hunting. Hey, Lucas! James shouted, his voice slurring. Get your nose out of that screen, mate. Lucas flinched, looking up with startled, wide eyes. I'm just playing, James. Playing? James sneered, stomping over to him. You're rotting your brain. You need to learn actual skills. Get up. Before Lucas could react, James grabbed him by the back of his t-shirt and hauled him upright. Lucas stumbled, dropping his phone onto the concrete. The screen cracked. Hey! Lucas cried out, reaching for it. Forget the phone, James barked, spinning the boy around. I'm going to teach you Royal Marines hand-to-hand combat. You need to know how to defend yourself, or high school will absolutely destroy you. The family laughed. Uncle Richard, filming on his own phone, chuckled. Yeah, teach him a proper lesson, James. Toughen him up. My stomach tightened. This wasn't a lesson. This was bullying disguised as tough love. Okay, listen, James announced to his captive audience. First thing you need to know is how to escape a chokehold. Come here." He wrapped his thick, sweaty arm around Lucas's neck. It wasn't playful. He clamped down hard, bearing the boy's head into his armpit. Lucas yelped, his hands clawing at James's forearm. "Ow, James, stop! It hurts!" Lucas's voice was thin and panicked. "It's supposed to hurt," James laughed, tightening his grip. "Pain is weakness leaving the body. Yeah? Now try to escape. Come on. Use your hips." Lucas was flailing now. His face was turning red. His feet scrabbled against the patio stones. He wasn't learning. He was being choked by a drunk 24-year-old who didn't understand his own strength or didn't care. "James, let him go," I said from the shadows, my voice low. But the party noise drowned me out completely. "Look at him," Aunt Margaret giggled, sipping wine. "He's like a little fish on a hook." "Mom!" Lucas screamed, tears streaming down his face. "Mom, help me! Please!" I looked at my sister-in-law, Lucas's mother. She stood frozen, holding a plate of brownies. She looked deeply uncomfortable, but she didn't move. She looked at my mother for guidance, and Catherine, the family matriarch, simply smiled that tight, superior smile. "Oh, stop crying, Lucas," she said, her voice cutting through the boy's sobs. "Don't be such a baby. James is simply playing. You need to learn to be tough. Let your cousin teach you something actually useful. Learn to be tough." The words struck me like a physical blow. The cruelty of it. The willful blindness. They were watching a child be genuinely terrified, be hurt, and they were calling it education. They were calling it masculinity. Lucas's struggles were weakening. His eyes were wide with terror, desperately scanning the circle of smiling adult faces, searching for a savior and finding only an audience. And in that look, the garden vanished. Suddenly, I wasn't in Surrey anymore. I was in a dusty village in northern Syria. The charcoal scent became burning rubber. The party music became the ringing in my ears following an explosion. Lucas's face became the face of a boy I'd pulled from rubble 3 years previously. A boy who'd looked at me with that same desperate, terrified plea, "Help me." My vision tunneled. The world's edges went gray. The only thing remaining in color, the only thing that mattered, was the threat and the victim. The mask of Arabella, the secretary, dissolved. The armor of the obedient daughter shattered. I didn't think. I didn't decide. The training took over. I set my plastic cup down on the small table beside Grandfather Ted. The movement was precise, deliberate. Grandfather Ted didn't try stopping me. He simply sat back, his eyes hard, and whispered one single word. "Go." I stepped out from beneath the oak tree. My movements were fluid, devoid of the clumsy hesitation I usually performed. I crossed the grass in 3 long strides, closing distance to the patio. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "James, I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I used the voice reserved for operations, the command voice. It was a tone that bypassed conscious thought and struck directly at primal obedience. Deep, resonant, utterly devoid of fear. The laughter died instantly. Uncle Richard lowered his phone. Aunt Patricia froze with her wine glass halfway to her mouth. James stopped squeezing, though he didn't release Lucas. He turned his head slowly, his eyes glassy and confused, trying to locate the source of the sound that had just cut through his drunken haze. He saw me standing there 10 feet away. My hands empty, hanging loose at my sides, my posture relaxed, but it was the relaxation of a coiled snake. "What did you say?" James sneered, attempting to regain his bravado, though his voice wavered. I repeated each word, landing like a hammer strike, "Let the boy go." "Or what?" James laughed, though it sounded forced. He tightened his grip on Lucas, making the boy whimper quietly. "You going to report me, Arabella? Write me up for bullying?" My mother stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "Arabella, get back inside. Don't you dare ruin this gathering with your drama. James is simply having fun." "This isn't fun," I said, my eyes never leaving James's face. I didn't even acknowledge her. "He's hurting him, and he's going to stop right now." "Who the hell are you to tell me what to do?" James spat, his ego flaring up, overriding any sense of self-preservation. He shoved Lucas away from him violently. The boy crumbled to the ground, coughing and clutching his throat. "You're nothing," James said, turning fully toward me, his chest heaving, his fists clenching. He took a deliberate step forward, entering my personal space. He loomed over me, using his height, using his bulk, trying to intimidate the small cousin. "You want to play soldier, Arabella," he growled, spit flying from his lips. "Come on then, make me stop." He raised his hands in a sloppy fighting stance. I looked at his hands. I looked at his feet. I looked at the exposed line of his jaw. Grandfather Ted was absolutely right. The dog had snapped, and for the first time in 11 years I wasn't walking away. "Your choice, James," I whispered, so only he could hear. "But you're not going to like how this ends." The silence in the yard was complete. Even the crickets seemed to be holding their breath. Everyone was waiting. Waiting for the secretary to retreat. Waiting for the mother to yell. Waiting for the boy to win. They were all profoundly wrong because the hero wasn't the one standing tall. The hero was the one about to bring him to his knees. James didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He reacted with the brute force of a wounded ego. "You bitch!" he screamed, his face contorted into pure drunken rage. He lowered his shoulder and charged. It was a classic rugby tackle, clumsy, telegraphed, completely dependent on mass. He intended to drive me backward into the patio, to use his 80 kilograms to crush the little secretary who dared question him. To him, I was just an obstacle, but to me, he was moving in slow motion. My world narrowed to pure geometry and physics. The party noise, my mother's gasp, Lucas's whimper, the music from speakers, it all faded into dull static. My heart rate didn't spike, it steadied. This was the place where I lived. This was the flow. Threat vector incoming. Center mass. Moderate velocity. I didn't step backward. Retreating would give him momentum. I didn't step forward. Engaging head-to-head would be a pure strength contest. And he was significantly heavier. So I disappeared. Just as James was about to make contact, just as he believed he had me, I pivoted. My left foot slid back and to the side in a smooth arc. My body turning 90 degrees like a closing door. James hit nothing but air, but I didn't simply let him miss. I guided him. My right hand shot out. I didn't strike, I guided. I placed my palm flat against his shoulder blade and shoved, adding my force to his momentum. James yelped, his feet tangling as he lost balance. He was falling forward, his back completely exposed. The cardinal sin in combat. Target exposed, execute. I moved in smoothly, my body flowed like water. Distance closed instantly. I kicked the back of his knee. A sharp, precise strike to the posterior knee. His leg buckled. He dropped to his knees with a grunt. His momentum arrested, but his balance destroyed. Before he could process that he was down, I was on him. I wrapped my left arm around his neck from behind. It wasn't a hug, it was a vice. My bicep pressed against the right side of his neck. My forearm bone dug into the left. I grabbed my own right bicep with my left hand, locking the hold. My right hand moved behind his head, pushing it forward, cinching the position tight. The rear naked choke, the anaconda, the perfect restraint. It wasn't about cutting air. That takes too long and they fight too hard. It was about blood. I compressed his carotid arteries, the highways delivering oxygen to his brain. James thrashed. He clawed at my arm, his fingernails digging into my skin. Desperate and wild, he tried throwing himself backward to slam me into concrete. But I'd already hooked my legs around his waist, grapevining his legs, flattening my hips against his back. I was a backpack he couldn't remove. "Stop!" someone screamed. Perhaps my mother, perhaps Patricia. It didn't matter. I leaned in close to James's ear. He was making gurgling noises now, his panic escalating as his vision started to tunnel. "General Mattis said something you should have learned in Bake's training, James," I whispered, my voice calm, almost intimate amidst the violence. "Be polite, be professional, but have a plan to kill everyone you meet." I tightened the grip by a fractional inch. "You forgot the plan," I murmured, "and you forgot the professionalism." His thrashing slowed. His movements became jerky, uncoordinated. His brain was starving. The lights were flickering in his consciousness. Carotid arteries compressed. I counted down silently in my head, syncing with the fading rhythm of his struggle. Hypoxia setting in. 3, 2, 1. James's arms dropped. His body went completely limp, all tension leaving in a single rush. He was dead weight in my arms now. I held him for one more second to be absolutely sure. Muscle memory from ensuring a target was neutralized. Then I released the lock. I unhooked my legs and stood, letting him slump forward onto the grass. He lay face down, snoring softly, his body trying to reboot. I took a step back. I looked down at my hands, steady, without any tremor. I reached up and adjusted my spectacles, which had slipped slightly during the conflict. I smoothed the front of my cardigan. I checked my pulse mentally. 65 beats per minute. A resting rate. Then I looked up. The scene was frozen. A tableau of absolute shock. My mother stood with her hands covering her mouth, eyes wide with horror. Uncle Richard was still holding his phone, but his arm hung limp at his side. Aunt Patricia looked like she might faint. Even Grandfather Ted looked surprised. Not that I'd won, but at the absolute efficiency of it. He raised his flask in a silent salute, a grim smile playing on his lips. Silence. The kind of silence that follows a gunshot. They were looking at me, but they weren't seeing Arabella, the secretary, anymore. They were seeing a complete stranger. A stranger who'd just dismantled their golden child in 6 seconds flat without breaking a sweat. I looked at Lucas. The boy was still sitting where James had shoved him, staring at me with absolute awe. He wasn't scared of me. He was looking at me like I was a superhero who'd just removed her disguise. I winked at him. Then I turned my attention to my mother. She took an involuntary step backward, fear flashing across her face, fear of her own daughter. "He'll wake up in approximately 1 minute," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet garden like a razor. "He'll have a headache and a bruised ego, but he'll survive." I looked down at James one last time. He looked so small now, so utterly harmless, just a boy who'd played a game he didn't understand. Next time, I said to the unconscious heap, "Don't mistake silence for weakness. If you felt that justice in your bones, hit like right now and tell me in the comments. Have you ever shocked absolutely everyone by revealing your true strength? Type underestimated if you know exactly how satisfying this moment truly feels." The spell broke. Aunt Patricia let out a piercing shriek that shattered the stillness. "He's dead. She's killed him. Oh my God, she's actually killed him." The chaos I'd held back flooded in completely. But I stood in the center of the storm, calm and completely untouched. I had crossed the line. I had revealed the monster. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care who witnessed it. Aunt Patricia's scream was still ringing in the humid air, piercing and hysterical, drawing neighbors to their windows 2 houses away. "Call the police," she shrieked, dropping to her knees beside James's unconscious form. She hovered over him, her hands fluttering uselessly around his face, checking for injuries that simply weren't there. "Richard, call 999. She's insane. She actually tried to kill him." The patio, which had been a stage for James's arrogance just moments before, was now complete bedlam. Uncle Richard was fumbling with his phone, his face pale, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. He didn't actually dial. He was too frightened to move, too frightened to provoke the woman who'd just incapacitated a Royal Marine in 6 seconds. James groaned, rolling onto his side. He coughed, a wet hacking sound, and clutched his throat. Color was returning to his face, replacing the ghostly pallor of hypoxia. "He's alive," I said flatly, not moving an inch. "He's perfectly fine. He simply took a nap." "You shut up," Aunt Margaret yelled from the safety of the sliding glass door. "You animal. Look what you've done to him." My mother, Catherine, finally found her voice. She marched toward me, her face contorted into pure venom. I'd seen her angry before when I got a B in maths, when I didn't make the netball team, when I skipped church. But this was absolute hatred. She stopped 2 feet from me and shoved my shoulder. It was a weak, frantic push that barely rocked me, but the intent was violent. "What is absolutely wrong with you?" she hissed, spit flying from her lips. "Are you insane? Are you taking something?" "He was playing with Lucas." "I said he was hurting Lucas," I replied, my voice perfectly calm, contrasting sharply with her frenzy. I pointed to where Lucas was still sitting on the ground, rubbing his bruised neck, watching the adults with confused, wide eyes. "Did all of you miss that part? He was actually choking a 13-year-old. He was playing." My mother screamed, her voice cracking. "They were boys simply roughhousing. But you attacked him unprovoked. You could have killed him." "I controlled every single movement, Mum," I said calmly. "If I wanted to kill him, he wouldn't be coughing right now." The words escaped my mouth before I could filter them. Cold. Factual. My mother recoiled as if I'd slapped her. She looked at me with genuine horror, not at the violence, but at the demonstrated capability, at the complete stranger occupying her daughter's skin. "You're jealous," she spat, shaking her head as if attempting to rearrange reality. "That's exactly what this is. You're jealous of James. You're jealous that he's a real hero and you're nothing. You're jealous that he has a life, a future, and you're just a bitter, lonely spinster. You're jealous." The words hit me like a physical blow. She looked at me with genuine horror, not at the violence, but at the demonstrated capability, at the complete stranger occupying her daughter's skin. I stared at her. The accusation was so utterly absurd, so completely detached from reality that I almost laughed. "I'm jealous," I repeated quietly. "Mum, genuinely look at him." James was sitting up now, supported by Aunt Patricia. He looked completely disoriented, rubbing his throat, his eyes darting around with fear. He absolutely wouldn't look at me. The bravado was gone, replaced by the shame of a bully who got checked hard. "He's a drunk 24-year-old who doesn't understand the first thing about actual combat," I continued. "And all of you are clapping for him like he's Captain Britain while he abuses a child. That doesn't make sense to me." "Don't you dare talk about him like that," Aunt Patricia yelled, cradling James's head protectively. "He serves this country. He protects people like you. He doesn't protect anyone." A gravel voice cut through the noise. Grandfather Ted stood up from his chair. He moved slowly, leaning on his walking stick, but his presence completely filled the yard. He walked over to where the family was huddled around James, casting a long shadow over them. "The girl is absolutely correct," Ted said, his voice low but thundering with authority. The boy was completely out of line. He was hurting the kid. Arabella stopped it. "You should be thanking her." "Dad, please stay out of this," my mother snapped, turning on her own father. "You're becoming senile. You're not seeing clearly." "I know a soldier when I see one," Ted growled, thumping his walking stick on the patio stones. "And I know a coward when I see one. James is the coward, and all of you?" He swept his gaze across the family, his eyes filled with absolute disappointment. "You're a bunch of blind fools." "That's absolutely enough," Uncle Richard shouted, finally finding courage now that the target was an elderly man. "Ted, please sit down. Catherine is right. Arabella is dangerous. Look at her. She's standing there like a psychopath. No remorse, no tears." I looked around the circle of faces. My mother, my aunts, my uncle. They were all looking at me with the same expression, fear and disgust. They didn't care about Lucas. I glanced at the boy. He'd crawled away to the edge of the garden, forgotten by his own parents in their rush to comfort the aggressor. They didn't care about right or wrong. They cared about the narrative. In their story, James was the golden child, the hero, the future. I was the scapegoat, the failure, the background noise. By taking James down, I hadn't just hurt him physically. I'd shattered their carefully constructed fantasy. I'd proven their hero was weak, and their failure was powerful. And that was absolutely unforgivable. "You need professional help, Arabella," my mother said, her voice dropping to a cold, completely dismissive tone. "You need psychological support. I don't know where you learned those skills, but it's not normal. It's sick." "It's training, Mum," I said, feeling the final tether of attachment snap inside my chest. "It's what keeps you safe at night. But you don't want to know that. You prefer the fairy tale." "Get out," she whispered. I raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "Get out of my house," she said louder, pointing a trembling finger toward the gate. "Leave before Richard calls the police. I don't want you here. You're not the daughter I raised." I looked at her. I looked at the woman whose approval I'd chased for 34 years. The woman whose criticism had driven me to push myself to excel, to become elite, to become lethal, simply to prove I was worth something. And I realized with absolute clarity, both heartbreaking and liberating, that I would never be enough for her. Not because I lacked value, but because she simply lacked the capacity to perceive it. "You're absolutely right, Mum," I said softly. "I'm not the daughter you raised. That girl died a long time ago in a desert you couldn't find on a map." I turned to Grandfather Ted. He gave me a sad, knowing nod. "Go," his eyes said. "Save yourself." Then I looked at Lucas. "You all right, mate?" He nodded, sniffling, clutching his phone. Thank you, Aunt Arabella. Keep your head up, I told him. Don't let them break you. I didn't look at James. He wasn't worth the eye contact. I turned my back on them. I turned my back on the accusations, the gaslighting, the toxic loyalty to falsehood. I walked toward the sliding glass door to retrieve my bag. My steps were steady and rhythmic. Behind me, the voices started up again, comforting James, vilifying me, rewriting history in real time. But their voices sounded distant now, like static on a radio channel I was finally tuning out. I was finished. This operation was cancelled. Time to extract. The interior of the house was cool and quiet, jarring contrast to the heat and hysteria of the garden. It felt like a museum of a family I didn't belong to. I walked through the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. On the walls, framed photographs smiled at me. James in his football uniform. My sister at her wedding. My mother receiving a gardening club award. There were no pictures of me. Not really. Just a blurry group shot from Christmas 6 years ago where I was standing in the back, half obscured by a Christmas tree. I reached the hallway table where I'd left my bag. I checked my essentials automatically. Keys, wallet, sunglasses. Check, check, check. I was ready to leave. I was ready to never return. But as I reached for the brass doorknob, a hand slammed against the wood, holding the door shut. I didn't flinch. I turned slowly to find my mother standing there. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving, her face flushed with a mixture of rage and desperation. She looked small, suddenly small and utterly petty. "You're not leaving," she said, her voice trembling. "Watch me," I replied, my tone perfectly even. "You're going to go back out there," she hissed, pointing toward the patio door, where the muffled sounds of Aunt Patricia's crying could still be heard. "And you're going to apologize to James. You're going to tell absolutely everyone that you had a breakdown, that you're on medication, that you're genuinely sorry." I looked at her, truly looked at her for what felt like the very first time. I saw the fear behind her eyes. Not fear for James, but fear for her reputation. Fear that the perfect suburban facade was cracking and I was the hammer. "No," I said. "Excuse me?" "No," I repeated louder. "I'm not apologizing for stopping a bully. And I'm certainly not lying to protect your social standing." "My social standing?" She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "I am trying to save your entire reputation, Arabella. Do you understand what they're going to say about you? That you're unstable? That you're violent? That you're completely unpredictable? No man is ever going to want to marry you after this." There it was again. The ultimate currency in her world. A husband. As if my entire existence, my entire value, hinged entirely on whether someone wanted to marry me. "I don't care what they say, Mum," I said, stepping closer to her. I loomed over her slightly, not with physical threat, but with the absolute weight of my presence. "And I don't actually care about finding a man to validate me." "You're pathetic," she sneered, falling back on her old weapons. "You're a glorified secretary, Arabella. You file documents, you answer phones, you live in a small flat, and you have absolutely nothing. James is in the Royal Marines. He's elite. You should be begging for his forgiveness." Something inside me finally broke, not with a bang, but with a quiet, decisive click. The lock on the door to my secret life turned. "You think I file documents?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper that was absolutely more terrifying than a scream. "I know you do," she scoffed. "That's literally all you're capable of." I leaned in, invading her personal space until I was inches from her face. I let the mask drop completely. I let her see the eyes that had stared down warlords. I let her feel the cold radiation of a true predator. "That logistics company in London," I said softly. "It doesn't exist, Mum. It's a front. A shell corporation for defense intelligence." Her eyes widened. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "I don't file documents," I continued, completely relentless. "I hunt people. Dangerous people. People who make James's sergeant instructors look like primary school teachers. I speak 4 dialects of Arabic. I have security clearance levels you don't even know exist. And those scars you think are ugly. I got them dragging a dying teammate out of a burning building in Aleppo while you were asleep in your comfortable bed." She took a step back, hitting the wall. She looked absolutely terrified. You're lying," she whispered, but her voice lacked any conviction. "Believe what you choose," I said, straightening up and adjusting my bag strap. But understand this. I am not the failure of this family. I am the shield that protects it. I am the reason you sleep peacefully. I reached for the doorknob again. This time, she didn't stop me. She couldn't. She was paralyzed by the sudden seismic shift in power dynamics. But before I opened the door, I turned back to her one final time. I needed to leave her with something she would never forget. Something that would burn every time she looked at her precious, fragile nephew. "You know, Mum," I said, a sad smile playing on my lips. "You always told me you wanted me to marry a strong man. Someone capable. Someone powerful." I gestured around the silent, empty hallway, encompassing the garden, the men drinking lager, the boys playing soldier. "It's genuinely unfortunate," I said, my voice heavy with finality. "Because in this entire house, the strongest person is me." I opened the door and walked out. The humid air hit me again, but this time it felt completely different. It didn't feel oppressive. It felt like freedom. As I walked down the drive toward my car, I saw movement at the side gate. Grandfather Ted was standing there, leaning on the fence. He wasn't smiling, but he raised 2 fingers to his brow in a casual salute. "Give him hell, kid," he mouthed silently. And behind him, peeking through the fence slats, was Lucas. He gave me a small, shy wave. I waved back, got into my car, and locked the doors. The sound of the locks engaging was the most satisfying sound I'd heard all day. It was the sound of a boundary being set permanently. I started the engine. The radio came on, resuming the podcast I'd paused hours earlier. The presenter was discussing extraction procedures, about knowing when a position is compromised and when it's time to leave completely. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the drive. I didn't look at the house. I didn't look at the window where I knew my mother was watching. I looked at the road ahead. I drove past rows of manicured lawns and Union Jack flags. I drove until the suburbs faded into the motorway. I drove until the sun finally set, leaving the world in complete darkness. But I wasn't afraid of the dark. The dark was where I did my best work. And for the first time in a long time, I was heading home. Not to the house I grew up in, but to the life I'd built. A life where strength was respected, silence is a virtue, and family was earned, not inherited. 6 months later, the air inside the classified Defense Intelligence Facility was filtered, recycled, and maintained at exactly 18 degrees Celsius. It smelled of ozone, gun oil, and high-grade coffee. It was a stark contrast to the humid, emotionally suffocating garden in Surrey, and I infinitely preferred it. Here the walls were completely soundproof. Here there were no windows to look out of and no prying eyes to look in. I stood at a metal workbench, stripping down my Browning HP9 handgun. My hands moved with rhythmic practiced efficiency, checking the slide, the spring mechanism, the barrel. Click, clack, snap. It was meditation. "Boss," I didn't look up immediately. I finished reassembling the weapon, racked the slide once to ensure it was seated properly, and holstered it on my hip. "Status, Mitchell?" I asked, turning to face the man standing in the doorway. Mitchell was 6 feet 4 inches tall, a former rugby player from Yorkshire, with hands the size of dinner plates and a beard that violated at least 3 different grooming standards. He was a Tier 1 operator, a man who could clear a room of hostiles in approximately 4 seconds, and he was looking at me with the kind of respect usually reserved for generals or saints. "Bird is fueled and prepped, ma'am," Mitchell said, his voice a low rumble. "Wheels up in 10 minutes. Intel confirms the package is moving tonight." "Good," I said, grabbing my plate carrier from the bench. "Tell the team to gear up. We go dark in 5. Roger that." He lingered for a second, watching me check the straps on my body armor. "You good, boss?" he asked, not out of doubt, but out of genuine loyalty. "You've been running quite hard lately." I paused, looking at him. In this room, surrounded by lethal professionals, I wasn't the disappointment. I wasn't the spinster. I was the asset. I was the leader. "I'm good, Mitchell," I said, offering him a rare, genuine smile. "Just entirely focused. Get to the helicopter." He grinned and disappeared down the hallway. I had 5 minutes before I had to surrender my personal electronics and vanish completely from the grid. I walked over to my locker, a gray metal box with my call sign, Wraith, stenciled on the front in white letters. Inside, sitting on the top shelf next to a spare magazine, was my personal mobile phone. I hadn't touched it in 13 hours. I picked it up, the screen illuminating my face in the dim light. One new notification. My thumb hovered over the screen. I knew the number. I hadn't deleted it, but I hadn't answered it previously either. It was James. I swiped open the message. It was lengthy, a wall of text sent at 2 hours past midnight, likely fueled by insomnia and genuine regret. Arabella, it read. I know you probably won't even read this. Mum told us not to contact you, but I absolutely had to say something. I leaned against the locker, feeling the cold metal through my tactical shirt. Uncle Richard sent me the Ring doorbell footage from the barbecue. I watched it. Approximately 50 times. I slowed it down frame by frame. I could picture him sitting in his barracks room or his parents' basement, hunched over a laptop, frame by framing the moment his world completely shifted. I saw what you did with your feet. The pivot. The weight transfer. The perfect choke. You didn't just grab me, you locked it perfectly. That wasn't self-defense class material. That was operator-level work. I scrolled down. I asked around. Some intelligence guys I know. They wouldn't tell me anything specific. But the way they went completely silent when I mentioned your name. Jesus, Arabella, who are you? A ghost? I thought I'm the ghost you were too loud to hear. I'm genuinely sorry about Lucas, the message continued. I was absolutely drunk, yeah, but that's completely no excuse. I was being a bully. You were entirely right. Grandfather Ted was entirely right. I felt small and I wanted to feel important. I'm sorry I made you leave. If you ever want to talk or teach me how to not get completely destroyed in 6 seconds, let me know. I stared at the words. 6 months ago, this message would have meant absolutely everything to me. It would have been the vindication I desperately craved. It would have been the evidence that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't the villain. But now it simply felt quiet. It was an echo from a life I'd already shed, like skin I'd completely outgrown. I didn't feel angry at James anymore. I didn't feel triumphant. I simply felt distant. Completely detached pity. He was finally seeing me, absolutely yes, but he was seeing only the cool parts, the violence, the skill. He still didn't actually know me. He didn't understand the nights I spent awake. He didn't comprehend the weight of the decisions I made. He didn't grasp the cost of the silence I maintained. And he never would because he hadn't earned that clearance level. My thumb moved to the top of the screen. I didn't type a response. I didn't type I forgive you. I didn't type go to hell. I tapped edit. Then select message. Then the trash can symbol. Delete conversation. This action cannot be undone. I pressed delete. The message vanished. The screen went completely blank. It was that simple. No drama, no tears, just a digital cleaning of house. I didn't need his apology to validate my worth. I didn't need my mother's approval to define my strength. I'd found my validation in the field, in the trust of men like Mitchell, in the quiet knowledge that when the world caught fire, I was the one holding the hose. I tossed the phone onto the shelf and slammed the locker shut. The sound echoed in the empty room like a gavel striking wood. Case closed. I put on my helmet, adjusting the night vision goggles until they clicked perfectly into place. I checked my radio frequency. I pulled on my gloves. The woman who craved acceptance at a family gathering in Surrey was gone. In her place stood Wraith. I walked out of the classified facility and into the hallway. The heavy steel door sealed behind me with a pneumatic hiss. The corridor was long and lit by red emergency lights. At the end of it, the tarmac waited. The mission waited. I wasn't lonely. Solitude is a state of isolation. Aloneness is a state of being. I was alone, yes, but I was absolutely whole. As I walked toward the roar of the waiting helicopter, I didn't look back. There was nothing behind me worth saving. Everything I needed was strapped to my chest and standing by my side. It was time to move. I had work to do. The tarmac was alive with the scent of jet fuel and the deafening roar of rotors cutting through the night air. It was a chaotic symphony of power, but to me it sounded like a lullaby. I walked toward the waiting Puma helicopter, the wind whipping my hair around my face. I didn't fight it. I let the rotor wash scour me clean, stripping away the final lingering doubts of the girl who used to apologize for existing. Mitchell was already inside, sitting near the door gunner position. He extended a gloved hand to pull me aboard. "Welcome aboard, boss," he shouted over the noise, his grip firm and completely reassuring. I hauled myself into the cabin and took my seat. Around me, the rest of the team was strapping in. There was Somerset checking the feed on his drone tablet. There was Davies double-checking his medical kit. And there was Mitchell giving a thumbs up to the pilot. I looked at their faces. They were tired. They were scarred. They were cynical and crude and dangerous. They didn't care about my relationship status. They didn't care about my fashion choices. They didn't care if I was conventionally feminine. They only cared about one thing. Could I do the job? Could I bring them home? And the answer, written in the absolute trust in their eyes, was yes. For 34 years, I'd been told that family was about blood, that it was about shared DNA, shared surnames, and shared Christmas dinners where you swallowed insults along with the turkey. I'd been told that you forgive family no matter what, because they're all you have. I looked at Mitchell, who had once taken a bullet in his plate carrier meant for me in Somalia. I looked at Somerset, who had spent 3 days digging through rubble with me after an earthquake in Haiti, absolutely refusing to sleep until we found survivors. I realized the profound lie I'd been fed. Blood is just biology. It's an accident of birth. It makes you related. It doesn't make you family. Family is the people who know the absolute worst parts of you and stay anyway. Family is the people who would bleed for you, not the ones who make you bleed. Family is loyalty. It is earned day by day in the trenches of life. The pilot's voice crackled in my headset. "Wraith, we are green across the board. Ready for lift." I pressed the transmit button on my chest rig. "Copy that. Let's fly." The helicopter lurched upward, absolutely defying gravity. The ground fell away. The base with its fences and lights shrank into a grid of geometry. As we climbed higher, banking toward the east, where the first hint of dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky, my mind drifted back to Surrey one final time, not to the house or my mother or James. They were fading now, becoming small and completely insignificant, like characters in a book I'd completely finished reading. I thought of Grandfather Ted. I pictured him sitting on his porch, nursing a cup of strong coffee, and maybe sneaking a cigarette. He was the only thread I hadn't cut. He was the bridge between my two worlds. He understood that sometimes you have to leave the people you love to save the person you are. I reached into my pocket and touched the small silver St. Christopher medal he'd pressed into my hand the day I graduated from selection. "Safe travels," he had said. "Protect the flock." I was protecting the flock. My flock. The sun broke the horizon, a brilliant line of gold that set the clouds on fire. It bathed the cabin in warm amber light. It reflected off the visors of my team, turning them into faceless angels of war. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the thin, cold air. The pain in my ribs was a distant memory. The ache in my heart was absolutely gone. For the very first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for permission to be happy. I wasn't waiting for approval to be strong. I looked out at the endless horizon, at the world waiting below. It was dangerous. It was messy. It was absolutely beautiful. And I was completely ready for it. A smile touched my lips. Not the polite, practiced smile of Arabella the secretary, but the fierce, wild smile of Wraith. I am Arabella Harrington. I am a warrior. I am a leader. And as the puma cut through the morning sky, carrying me toward the mission and the men who would die for me, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't running away. I was finally home. We all carry scars that our families can't see. If my story resonated with you today, it's because you know the absolute truth. Silence isn't weakness, it's discipline. And you don't owe your loyalty to anyone who treats you like you're invisible. Real family is earned. If you're ready to stop apologizing and start living entirely on your own terms, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We are building a community of survivors here, and I genuinely want you in it. And tell me in the comments below, who is the grandfather Ted in your life? The one person who absolutely always believed in you when absolutely nobody else did. Let's honor them today. Stay safe. Stay strong. This is Arabella Harrington signing off.